Hey everyone, this is a follow-up to my two-parter on the Roanoke colony. This was England's first attempt at a proper English colony, a civilian-run settlement in the Americas. Before this, Sir Walter Raleigh had attempted to set up military-style settlements in the Americas, and those had all failed. And for some reason they thought, well, if the military can't hack it, surely a bunch of women and children will make it work. I think that the idea behind it was that the soldiers couldn't hack it because there was no one there to take care of them. There was nobody there to plant the fields, to sew the linens, to cook the food, and that morale was low because they were set to sort of fend for themselves. But the reality of it was, the reason that they weren't making it there is because they couldn't make friends with the natives. Though certain representatives of England and the Britons were able to make friends with natives or create good relations with them, the soldiers were just seen as warriors. They were seen as like a soft invasion on the Americas, at least in the Northern Carolina, Virginia area. Now, I got a little of the history wrong in the two-parter. Sorry, I'm not really a historian. I do love history, but the 1500s, the Renaissance era in general, really, I'm not super familiar with. So I was learning a lot of this on the fly. Luckily, a lot of you corrected me on that, and I'm gonna try to address a little bit of what I got wrong. The first video, the focus was, of course, to say that they became zombies. And that was a lot of fun, though as plausible as that is, and I don't really think that's super likely, it's just one of those pop culture sort of explanations to the Roanoke colony mystery. Part two sort of shows how the mystery wasn't even really a mystery, that it was more of a cover-up. I'm going to address some of that in this video as well. Some of your comments sort of challenged that concept, or at least some of the concepts that I brought forward, but I'm going to defend some of those because, again, mainstream history, even the most well-renowned historians that know Sir Walter Raleigh, John White, and that whole crew, Queen Elizabeth, as well as they do, they sort of stick to this very specific narrative. I know, surprise, surprise, Armoured skeptic doesn't believe mainstream history. I wasn't trying to rewrite history. I think that in the Tell Me More series, what I like to do more is look at all of the pieces and make my own narrative based on what I can find. And afterwards, when I, talk to you like this later, I can compare it to what the mainstream narrative is. I think sometimes an outsider perspective like that, even though what I said overall was probably wrong, I think that I challenged enough of the mainstream narrative to say that there's reason to question what we've been told. So the number one example is that the word Croatoan carved on the tree was supposed to be this big mystery. Why would they write Croatoan? And though it is grammatically incorrect to write Croatoan when they should have written Croatoa, to write Croatoan is a little bit sort of cryptic. And then to write CRO, I wondered if that was sort of like a clue or like a code word that they were using. There's this whole concept of religious separatism. And that's another thing that I sort of got wrong a little bit with, at least with some of the details. But I'm not the first person to suggest that the colony might have been a group of religious separatists that were trying to disappear into the Americas. And it's not even really that crazy to think that that's what happened, because after the first couple military settlements failed, Sir Walter Raleigh thought, we got to get women and children over there. We got to make it a proper colony, the self-sustaining little miniature society over there. To convince 120 people, husbands, wives, children, to go all the way across the ocean to a new land that has no infrastructure, no government, nothing set up, and you're surrounded by hostile native groups. What they had to do is essentially lie to them and say that, America is a land of opportunity. Like, that lie has existed from the day one. They sold it as this Garden of Eden paradise. And it had a lot to do with John White's painting of the Croatoan and the Secatan people, showing that they ate well, managed the elements, and they could still survive, and they did much better there than the average English citizen. Like, again, that's not even a concept that I came up with on my own. That's literally how they sold the venture to the people who decided to invest their lives in South Virginia. But I don't want to ramble too much. Of course, this is about the comments, so let's get to the comments here. Ghost Trap says, the reality is the colony integrated with the Croatoans. I know that seems like the easy answer, and Occam's razor says that we should believe that because we later found out that Governor John White instructed the colonists to write Croatoa on the tree and then go to Croatoa if they were in trouble and integrate with that native group. But the problem with that answer is it would have been impossible. We're talking about a colony of about 120 people, most of them men. Even if they wanted to, there's no way they could have accommodated 120 people, and they would have absolutely have been paranoid about allowing somewhere around 50, we'll say men, adult fighting aged men, to just integrate with the men and women and children of their own tribe. That would have been a logistical nightmare and would have been entirely unsafe. We're talking about a fairly small island. Hatteras Island is fairly tiny. And what made the Croatoan and the Secatan tribes so rich and abundant with the food that they had was that they had so few people to share that food with. Introducing 120 people, 50 plus men, to a society that already had this perfect little homogeny, that was perfectly balanced in the way that they ran themselves, it just couldn't have worked. It would have collapsed that little society. It's also pretty well known that the Secatan did not like the colonists at all. They considered the military groups that came before them to both be miniature invasions, and they would have seen a group of 120 people as a mass invasion. If, like, best case scenario, all of the settlers all lived, which they probably didn't, and then all decided to go to live with the natives, they would have had to have split up into different native tribes. And another thing that I didn't really want to get into in the two-parter because it's sort of a loaded subject, but some of those people likely would have ended up in indentured servitude, if you get my meaning, into some of these tribes. The natives loved that the colonists could work metals, soft metals like brass and tin and stuff like that, which was very valuable back then. To give you perspective here, a tin plate about this big was worth about 50 deer hides, and the average English sailor, his annual salary was only worth 5 deer hides. They also liked that the settlers could do leather work and stone work, and all of those things were definitely seen by later travelers that came to the Americas. They found natives that had intricate leathers, intricate stone work, intricate metal work, and they sort of just brushed that off as earlier trading. If you pair that together with the fact that later explorers found lighter skinned natives that had gray and blue eyes and knew Latin and knew Sir Walter Raleigh's name, chances are that a good deal of the settlers did survive. But how many of them, we're not sure. There is that stone that's supposedly written by Virginia Dare's mother, John White's daughter, Eleanor White Dare. It says that most of the colonists were killed about 5 or 10 years after they landed there. Most of them. And then only 11 or 12 of them survived. Cryptic Wizard says, if you think the Queen's relationship with Raleigh, sorry, that was another thing I got wrong, is it's not Sir Walter Raleigh, it's Sir Walter Raleigh. Sorry. If you think the Queen's relationship with Raleigh was odd, look into her relationship with Robert Dudley. Yeah, there were several men in her court, as they call it, that she flirted with the idea of marrying or being in a relationship with. She was the Virgin Queen, so she couldn't take a husband by saying that she's the Virgin Queen. She can come off as more virtuous, and that was another thing that was very important to her, to come off as this perfect woman. She wasn't, though. I'm gonna get to that a little later. They had a whole do they or don't they thing going on until he died, after which she apparently never really recovered. Dudley was the one that came closest to marrying her, at least that's what history records, but it's commonly known that Raleigh was her favorite. The only reason that she wouldn't have married Raleigh is because he was like 20 years younger than her. I think she was 40 when she finally allowed him into her court, and he wooed her. He wrote like poems and sonnets and stuff for her. He was very charming. Some of the photos of him show him wearing the frilliest of lace, and he had the cutest beard and then these baby blue eyes, and he wore flowers in his hair. He was very flamboyant in the way that he presented himself. I think she would have married Dudley, but between what happened to her mother and all of her stepmothers, I think she thought it unwise. That doesn't make a lot of sense because yeah, obviously her father, King Henry VIII, and he got tired of divorcing wives and it got sort of tedious. He only divorced the one because he genuinely loved her, but she couldn't provide a son for him. Then after that, he got bored of divorce and he would just behead or execute every woman that couldn't provide a son for him. That wouldn't have happened to Elizabeth. There was also the fact that if she married a Duke of Anjou or something, the power over England would fall out of England's hands. When her sister was queen, the Spaniards basically attempted a coup. England was basically in dire straits when Elizabeth inherited it. It was the poorest it had been in such a long time. Its navy was so weak, so super weak, especially compared to the Spanish, who were the naval superpower at the time, and they were the ones that were up England's ass the most. And the fact that the war that started with the Spanish didn't start earlier, because the Spanish could have just taken England if they really wanted to, is a testament actually to the patience of Spain. Again, I'll get to that later. But that's absolutely true. She couldn't just marry any duke or any king or anything because the power over England would have just disappeared. Elijah says, side note on Sir Walter Raleigh, he was a delusional El Dorado hunter who kicked it off by kidnapping a conquistador and made up a bunch of weird ideas that were just adopted by other hunters. That's actually almost, I think, the first thing he did after the whole Roanoke fiasco was 3 years later when they found that they were missing. He didn't really have many other conquests in the Americas, but he thought he might be able to find the City of Gold. He didn't. He also ended his hunt by breaking into a Spanish fort, getting his son killed in the process, and now that there was no queen to protect him, he was executed to avoid another war. So that's one of the reasons people think that he was executed, was because of the shenanigans he was getting into overseas. I think that King James, in general, just knew that Sir Walter Raleigh was up to no good, that he was undermining the crown. The truth is that Sir Walter Raleigh didn't really respect royalty. He didn't respect the crown. He played the part. He liked to dress himself up. He liked to present himself as a gentleman. And he liked to woo and get the favor of rich people, of lords and ladies, and of course the queen. And he was very good at that. He was almost to the level of like a con man. He was very charismatic. Sure, he had a lot of confidence and he was a lot better at it than his cousin, but he had an older cousin, Drake. And Drake was basically the one that sort of started that whole theme of undermining the wants and needs of the crown. And Elizabeth sort of set this precedent where privateers could get away with terrible things, crimes, war crimes even, and attacking other nations that they weren't at war with, which was highly illegal and was actually on Queen Elizabeth for allowing those things to happen. For example, Drake, he's famous for having a bullet wound in his leg and a scar on his head from getting piked. Yes, he got piked in the head and survived. Maybe like 10, 20 years before Raleigh ended up gaining any kind of favor with the queen and amassing his wealth. His older cousin Drake was already a privateer. He got the license from Elizabeth, and he wasn't supposed to. It was illegal to do it. It was technically piracy what he was doing. But he went over to South America, went under the tip, ended up looting gold and silver mines in Peru, which was technically controlled by the Spanish at the time. And then the Spanish chased after him. So instead of going back down under South America to Europe, he decided to sail across the Pacific Ocean, which I don't think anybody had done before that, but definitely no English person had done that before. And he successfully managed to get back to Europe from the Pacific Ocean, loaded down with Spanish booty, which is just insane if you think about it, in those tiny little 16th century ships. And then when he got back to Queen Elizabeth, he gave her everything that he had looted. And what she should have done legally is execute him and give those goods back to the Spanish. However, England was in so much debt, Queen Elizabeth used that to pay off the entire national debt. So of course she's not going to punish him for that. And it was, I think, that act specifically that enabled that entire era of privateers basically using their power and using their licenses to get away with murder, get away with horrible crimes that they should have been executed for. And the war with the Spanish that happened after the Roanoke colony had been established happened because the privateers were trolling Spanish vessels. And that was Raleigh's entire plan with the Roanoke colony, I think, was to set up an established colony where he could use as like a launching base for his vessels. He had an entire fleet by this point that was under his control, and Drake also had an entire fleet of ships under his control. And I think what they wanted to do was use that as a launching point to just attack Spanish ships that were coming up back to Europe from South America. And of course, again, highly illegal. They were not supposed to do this. But Queen Elizabeth had enabled this and essentially was encouraging it in her behavior. And that's what I meant in the video when I said that he would do all these crimes and get arrested, but then was able to find favor with the Queen. That was something that his cousin taught him. That if you do something highly illegal as a privateer that you're not supposed to do, if you commit piracy, but you give the better part of the goods to the Queen, she's just gonna forgive you. And that's partially because of her ineptitude as a leader, maybe, but also just because, again, England was in dire straits at this time. And again, Anglicanism had only just been established like a few decades earlier. So there were constant worries and threats of Catholic uprising in England itself, as well as from Ireland. And I'll get to that story a little later. Pentecost says, as an Englishman that has extensively studied this era in history, xenophobia would have been way down the list of concerns anyone would have had at the time. It was a private enterprise that the English crown would have had almost no investment in. Meanwhile, England was effectively at war with half the continent and concentrating on not being invaded by France or Spain, while also avoiding attempted coups. And that is true that the crown had bigger concerns than what happened to some random colony, but they still would have felt the embarrassment of the fate of that colony because it was still their people, and the Queen still blessed the excursion. She blessed the enterprise, meaning it wouldn't have happened unless she allowed it. So she still has a responsibility to it. And then if word got out that something terrible happened to them, or that they became Native Americans or savages, as they would have put it back then, that would have still been an embarrassment to the crown. Even if the crown didn't start or ask for the enterprise to happen, it still would have been on her. They would have had an investment in covering up what actually happened to them to avoid their own embarrassment. Hell, a famous Elizabethan era hero where I live was a privateer pirate that had converted to Islam, had an all-Arab crew, and married a Turkish woman. Islam is a religion, and it's not a society. It's not a people. It's a belief system. And Turkey was a developed nation. Sure, the Anglicans didn't love Islam. They didn't love the Turkish. They didn't love Muslim people. compared to Anglicans or maybe even Catholics, because at least those were Christians, but we're still talking about Abrahamic belief systems, and we're still talking about developed nations and civilized people. So yes, they were like enemies to their belief system, and they were sort of intolerant against those belief systems, but, hiring a privateer that's Islamic to do work for you is a very different thing than saying that your own English people moved to a place where people wear loincloths and walk around with no shirts on and dance around in fire circles. We're talking about people who lived in stone buildings and could man ships and had like an Abrahamic belief system versus what they considered pagans. You definitely would not hire a pagan privateer. If you point to me one pagan privateer that Queen Elizabeth hired, I will eat humble pie. I absolutely will eat a giant fucking slice of humble pie right on camera in front of all of you. As long as you brought treasure home and killed Spaniards and or Frenchmen, you could sleep with and believe what you liked. That's not true. First of all, the colonists of Roanoke didn't bring home anything. In fact, the supplies that they went to America with, most of them sank to the bottom of the ocean or had to be reverted back home because of some sort of weather condition. So the colonists' own supplies didn't even make it to America. And then when they got there, they did not bring home a single red penny. They didn't bring home any bacon. They didn't loot, pillage. They didn't kill anyone. They disappeared. So if they had disappeared and become pagans and brought home nothing, that still would have been a huge embarrassment to the crown. Racism or religious intolerance were just for those who didn't get results. I think I made my point. Sure, you might be able to argue even that the Queen might have forgiven them for becoming pagan if they had created some sort of a result. But you're also comparing apples to oranges here because you're talking about privateers. And to become a privateer, you have to be licensed. Walter Raleigh and Drake, they got away with murder because they were already contracted as privateers. So yes, they could have done weird shit and gotten away with it because they were working for the Queen. But the colonists were not working for the Queen. They were just sort of tertiary representatives of her in the West. So if they had befallen to some sort of shameful fate, the Queen would have absolutely wanted to have distanced herself from that. But speaking of like privateers, they wouldn't even always hire privateers that were English. For example, the privateer that they hired to take the colony to Roanoke, that abandoned them there. First of all, he abandoned them there because he was a privateer and he knew that he could fulfill his contract to the minimum letter, not even really do what he promised he would do and still get paid for it. And that's what happened. And he didn't get punished for it because what are they gonna do? All he had to say was, oh, the weather's bad, I couldn't do it. You notice that a lot with privateers. They always say the weather's bad, so they couldn't do it. And the contractor, the queen or king that had hired them would always just have to accept that answer because what are they gonna do? England's navy was so weak at the time, they couldn't afford to send their own ships to do things like that. So they had to rely on privateers. They had to rely on people that were in business for themselves. But the privateer that they hired to take the colony to the Americas wasn't even English. He was Portuguese. And if you look him up on Wikipedia, it lists his loyalties as Portugal, Spain, and then England last. So there's reason to believe that the colony was left there by this privateer because the Spanish had hired him to run reconnaissance for them to see what the fuck Sir Walter Raleigh's colony was doing there in the first place. He probably figured out everything he could, maybe even intentionally made things as difficult for them as possible, dumped them somewhere where he didn't even promise he was going to leave them, just so that they were out in the open somewhere where the Spanish could get to them. And then when he left, told the Spanish, hey, I put them in Roanoke, they're screwed, there's nothing they can do, have at them. For all we know, that's what happened. And that's the thing about a privateer, is they could have taken two contradictory contracts at the exact same time, fulfilled both of them to their minimum amount, showed favor to whoever was paying him the most, and then just go back home and get double paid for not even really doing the job he promised to do. That's why I said Sir Walter Raleigh might have even have been a spy, or, you know, been doing some espionage. There was even a time when he tried to defect to Spain, and he told the Spanish ambassador, he promised to give the king one of his ships as a gift, and said that he would work for him against the English, and the Spanish said no. So he just gave the ship to Elizabeth instead. But these were not good people. These were not loyal people. This is why we call them all pirates today, because they would always push their ability to act of their own accord to the nth degree. And they'd always force the royalty that hired them to sort of just deal with whatever decisions they made along the way. They would often double dip. I mean, one day they could take a contract from Queen Elizabeth to take a group of people from one island to another. And then the next day they take a contract from a king to kill those people. And they would just do that. That was the way they lived. All right, this is where I actually have to eat a little bit of humble pie here. Matt DW says, Sir Walter Raleigh was English, not Irish. Plus, he was very anti-Catholic. So I did get that wrong. He was not Irish. What I should have said in the video was that he was Celtic. So Raleigh was not from like blue blood. He was not a gentleman. He was not born into money. He and Drake both came from farm families, and they ended up sort of getting into marinerism. They both tried very hard to gain esteem and to make a name for themselves, but no matter how much they did, no matter how much clout they created, no matter how much wealth they accumulated, no matter how much they did for the Queen, no matter how good of friends they were with her and how much time they spent in her court, even as Queen Elizabeth's favorite, Raleigh, and then his older cousin Drake, just could never break through the stigma of being born on a farm, a commoner. And there was no way to get out of that. There was no way to break that stigma. And sure, they're from England. They were from West England, but they were from a part of West England that spoke kind of a dirty Celtic language. They were one of the last strongholds for non-proper English speaking. And, you know, well after that, there was Wales, Isle of Man, Scotland, and Ireland, of course, that all spoke Celtic languages. But they spoke Devonshire, which is like a dirty English, which was like very Celtic. And just from the very virtue of not being born in a properly English-speaking place, they would have always have been considered second or even third-class citizens, no matter how fancy a doily Sir Walter Raleigh wore around his neck, no matter how many flowers and jewels he wore in his hair, no matter how close he got to the Queen. He was always going to be that. There was no way around it. And Raleigh didn't care about that. He didn't care about that at all. He just wanted to appear like a gentleman, and he just liked the wealth. Like, Elizabeth loved him. Like I said, he was her favorite. She gave him like a monopoly on cloth and a monopoly on wine. And with all the power that she gave him, he ended up accumulating a lot of wealth. And with that, he would travel around the world. He would find all sorts of neat things. He introduced tobacco to England. He introduced the potato to Ireland. And the reason that I mistook him for an Irishman is because he actually had a home in Ireland. And so did Governor John White. They both lived in Ireland, and I think that that might have even been their favorite home. And as for him being anti-Catholic, I can see how you could come to that conclusion, because the job that he did to actually get into the Queen's favor in the first place was stop a Catholic uprising in Ireland. The Spanish and Italians had both sailed to Ireland with the Pope's blessing to start a Catholic revolution. And I think they amassed an army of about 600-ish people, and Raleigh was in charge of the militia group that was sent to stop that militia group. and he ended up getting them to surrender. He disarmed them, and his orders were to slaughter them all. And he did that. And he buried all their skulls in a field that is now called the Field of Skulls. And some of them were even like pregnant women that he slaughtered. So it was pretty terrible. But he didn't actually give a fuck about Anglicanism. He wasn't pro-Anglican. He did that to get the Queen's favor. And I think that I've demonstrated with earlier parts of this video that only meant so much to him. It wasn't out of loyalty to the Queen that he did that. It wasn't out of loyalty to Anglicanism or his hatred of Catholicism that did that. It was for his own personal gain. And I think that it's totally reasonable that even if he wasn't helping or wanting these religious separatists to separate from England and then become Catholics in the New World, even if that wasn't his plan, he probably knew that was going to happen and allowed it because he didn't care. Anyways, like I said, Sir Walter Raleigh was basically the real-life Han Solo. The man was my hero. No. What's most important coming from my two-part series is that zombies are possible. And that Sir Walter Raleigh was such an ambiguous person who didn't really give a fuck and didn't have proper loyalties, that there's no way of knowing for sure exactly what his motivations were behind every decision except his own personal gain. I don't think he ever actually wanted to marry Queen Elizabeth. She was like 40 years old and he was in his 20s when they met. So he was only wooing her to get her favor. He became her favorite because he was like a pretty boy and she was like sort of this old lady that probably was very impressed by having this young pretty boy acting so romantic with her. But he ended up covertly marrying and impregnating one of her maids, which was a big no-no. And in fact, there was even discussion as to whether or not that maid was one of King Henry's illegitimate daughters, meaning that maid might have even have been Elizabeth's younger sister. So Elizabeth didn't take very kindly to that, and she ended up arresting him and putting him in the Tower for a long time for that decision, but then eventually let him go because what are you gonna do? It's not like he technically did anything wrong. But the theory behind that was that she loved him and she wanted him to herself. But she also had like 4 or 5 other suitors, most of which were old enough to actually marry her, like Duke, what's his name, that I talked about before. Anyways, you guys get the point. Thanks a lot for watching. Catch me next time. I'm gonna do a follow-up on the Art Bell video. It'll probably just be a short one because that was just a fun little Halloween special. But I'd still like to go over some of the things you guys said. So I'll catch you next time.